It began with papers falling from the sky instead of bombs. Soldiers looked up, expecting an attack, only to find headlines declaring their own defeat. In the final winter of World War II, the deadliest weapon carried no gunpowder at all. But who was really controlling the truth? The snow was falling hard over Bastogne that December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge had reached its darkest hours. American forces, surrounded and exhausted, braced for another German strike. But what arrived that day wasn't gunfire. It came from the sky, and it carried no sound of war. At first, soldiers thought it was snow drifting strangely through the clouds. But soon they realized those weren't flakes. They were papers. Thousands of them, tumbling through the gray air like a blizzard of lies. The leaflets hit the ground in waves. Some clung to the icy earth, others stuck to helmets and rifles. The soldiers stared, puzzled. The headlines screamed in bold black letters, "Roosevelt dead, America surrenders." Another read, "Your families starve while you fight." No one fired a shot. No one moved. The battlefield fell eerily quiet as men bent down to read. Some laughed nervously. Others looked uneasy. They had seen enemy leaflets before, but never like this. The English was perfect. The paper looked real. Even the printing resembled their own army publications. No bombs fell that morning, but morale did. The men didn't know it yet, but this was a new kind of weapon, one that didn't wound the body, but attacked the mind. The Germans had discovered that if you could shatter belief, you could break an army without firing a single bullet. By 1944, both sides had already dropped billions of leaflets across Europe. But in Bastogne, psychological warfare entered its most dangerous phase. This was no longer crude enemy taunting, it was science. The German propaganda ministry had turned deception into precision engineering. They studied the fears of the American soldier, homesickness, doubt, exhaustion, and designed their messages like poison tailored for the human spirit. The leaflets claimed that the war was lost, that Washington had fallen into chaos, that American leaders were lying to their troops. Each line was calculated to weaken trust, the glue that held the Allied front together. Some soldiers ignored the papers. Others folded them into pockets, unable to forget the words. One private wrote in his diary that night, "They make you wonder, what if some of it's true?" The weapon had worked, not through force, but through suggestion.
Across the frozen forests of Belgium, intelligence officers began collecting the leaflets, analyzing the ink, the fonts, even the printing texture. What they found was alarming. The forgeries were near perfect, the kind that could pass for official communication if planted inside supply drops or mail deliveries. Somewhere deep in occupied Europe, someone was running an operation far beyond anything the Allies had anticipated. American commanders realized the implications quickly. If these messages continued spreading unchecked, they could fracture entire divisions from within. A soldier who doubts his mission is as vulnerable as one out of ammunition. But the damage wasn't just military. It was psychological. Each leaflet was designed to exploit emotion, not logic, to make soldiers feel isolated, abandoned, betrayed. It wasn't random either. Reports from across the Ardennes showed that specific units, the ones under heaviest pressure, were being targeted most. The timing was uncanny, almost coordinated with enemy movements. The idea was simple, yet devastating. Soften morale before the next assault. The Germans had learned that in modern war, control of information could be as lethal as control of territory. Propaganda became a silent front, a battlefield without borders, fought through rumors, papers, and whispers. But what made it so dangerous was how believable it felt. The words weren't wild lies, they were carefully mixed truths. A half-truth could travel faster than a bullet and cut deeper. The U.S. Psychological Warfare Division, established in 1942, had warned about such tactics, yet few imagined it could be weaponized with such precision. Now, those warnings were no longer theory. They were falling from the sky. As the wind scattered the last of the leaflets across the snow, American troops realized something unsettling. They weren't just fighting Germans in trenches or tanks. They were fighting an unseen enemy, one that lived inside their thoughts. That night, under the cold flicker of lanterns, officers quietly ordered all leaflets destroyed. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had already been planted. And somewhere behind enemy lines, the architects of this psychological offensive were already planning their next move, one that would strike not from the sky, but from the heart of American belief itself. The propaganda war had begun, and it was about to become far more dangerous than anyone could imagine.
In early 1945, the tide of war seemed to be turning. The Allies were pushing deeper into Europe, and German resistance was crumbling. Yet, in the dim offices of American intelligence in Paris, something didn't make sense. Frontline reports from Belgium and the Rhineland began showing strange irregularities. Patrols described enemy units fighting with renewed confidence, even when outnumbered. Captured prisoners mentioned Allied defeats that never happened. And across scattered divisions, soldiers whispered rumors that their generals had concealed the truth about the war's progress. At first, command dismissed these as frontline gossip, but one man wasn't convinced. Intelligence officer Marcus Webb, a quiet analyst known for noticing what others overlooked, began connecting the dots. The rumors followed a pattern, appearing in areas just days before major German counterattacks. Something unseen was shaping the battlefield before bullets ever flew. Inside a smoke-filled office in Paris, Webb spread out dozens of confiscated papers across a long wooden table. They looked like normal reading material, newspapers, letters, even familiar magazines. But when he looked closer, the deception became clear. The Germans had mastered imitation. There it was, a perfect replica of Stars and Stripes, the official newspaper of the U.S. Army. The headlines announced Allied retreats, American cities in flames, and demands for soldiers to abandon a hopeless fight. Even the fonts and ink matched the genuine issues. To an exhausted soldier under shell fire, the difference would have been impossible to see.
Next to it, Webb laid down another piece, a counterfeit Life magazine cover showing New York reduced to rubble under an air raid that never happened. On another page, a letter written in flawless English, supposedly from a soldier's wife in Kansas, begged her husband to come home before it's too late. It was propaganda dressed as truth, lies wrapped in familiarity. Through captured archives, Webb traced the source back to a unit operating under Otto Skorzeny, one of Germany's most resourceful intelligence officers. The scale of their operation was staggering. Millions of copies were printed using genuine American paper stock smuggled from captured depots. Even ink formulas were replicated from original samples. To the enemy, it wasn't just about confusion, it was about psychology. They weren't trying to make soldiers surrender immediately, they were trying to make them hesitate. A moment's hesitation in war could mean everything. Reports soon confirmed the effect. In some divisions, morale fell by nearly 15% within days of leaflet drops. Desertion attempts quietly increased. Men began doubting whether the victories they heard about were even real. The power of the propaganda wasn't in its words, it was in its precision. Each campaign targeted specific American units, the ones scheduled to move next or those resting after heavy losses. The Germans were preparing their psychological battlefield days before their tanks even rolled forward.
This discovery sent shockwaves through Allied command. It wasn't just an attack on soldiers' confidence, it was an attack on the foundation of communication itself. If the enemy could make truth indistinguishable from lies, they could turn trust into a weapon. Webb spent sleepless nights studying captured documents, trying to predict the next move. He noticed that every fake publication carried hidden patterns, a particular phrasing, an ink mark, or an unnatural date alignment. He realized they weren't random at all. Each drop coincided with troop redeployments or intelligence leaks. It meant the Germans had access to frontline information faster than expected. There was a leak somewhere, or worse, someone inside the Allied command structure was feeding them movement data. But Webb couldn't prove it yet. As the weeks passed, enemy leaflets appeared in new regions, near Aachen, along the Moselle, and even within American-held sectors far from the front. The propaganda machine was adapting, spreading like a virus. The next phase was far more sophisticated. German agents began releasing counterfeit letters into postal routes, disguised as mail from families back home. Soldiers who received them believed they were real, personal notes from loved ones expressing fear, despair, and resentment of the war. Some even contained specific details about family towns gathered from intercepted correspondence. It was psychological warfare disguised as comfort. Webb's analysis confirmed what many refused to believe. This wasn't chaos. It was orchestration. The enemy had learned that destroying morale could slow an army faster than destroying its supply lines. By February, American intelligence compiled the first official report documenting the phenomenon. The title read, Operation False Victory. It outlined the German plan to create the illusion of Allied collapse, to build a fictional victory narrative within American ranks. But Webb saw something deeper. These weren't just lies meant to deceive soldiers. They were designed to mirror their private fears, failure, futility, betrayal. The real target wasn't logic. It was emotion. And that's what made it deadly. For the first time, the U.S. Army realized that propaganda wasn't a sideshow of war. It was war. A war fought without smoke or sound, but with devastating precision. Webb recommended immediate countermeasures, but by then, the enemy was already preparing a new escalation. Reports from the Ardennes mentioned something strange, broadcasts coming from deep within German lines, in English, using American voices. The leaflets had been the beginning. What came next would blur reality itself. Webb didn't know it then, but the propaganda war was about to shift from paper to airwaves, and what the Germans were planning next would strike directly at the hearts and minds of the men holding the line. The false victories were only the start. By February 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final act, at least on the battlefield. But in the shadows, a different kind of war had just reached its climax. The Germans had perfected their invisible weapon, and its next target wasn't the eyes, it was the ears. American soldiers stationed along the front began hearing rumors of a strange new broadcast. It aired late at night, just beyond the static of Allied frequencies. Those who tuned in expecting music or home news found something else. Voices that sounded unmistakably American, calm, confident, and eerily familiar. The announcers spoke in the tone of official newscasters, delivering what seemed like credible updates. Reports confirm heavy Allied losses in the Ardennes, reinforcements delayed, command divisions cut off. For the first few nights, most dismissed it as enemy trickery. But then came the detail that changed everything. The weather report. It was perfect, exact, the same as that morning's official forecast.
The broadcasts used real data, real names, and even genuine American songs between news segments. It felt authentic because it was designed to. This was the enemy's masterpiece, a coordinated radio deception that blurred the line between truth and fabrication so completely that even trained communications officers began to hesitate. The broadcast claimed to be from an American relay station in Europe. The anchor introduced himself with a common Midwestern accent, spoke about baseball, and even mentioned popular radio sponsors that every soldier recognized.
And then, in between comfort and familiarity, came the poison. Reports of massive Allied casualties, claims that key generals had been captured, rumors that Germany had developed new miracle weapons capable of turning the tide of war. The manipulation was elegant. The truth and the lies were woven together so seamlessly that the listener couldn't untangle one from the other. Soon, Allied intelligence began intercepting these transmissions. The technical team confirmed their origin, deep inside German territory, using powerful mobile transmitters mounted on trucks. It wasn't entirely new. The Allies had already known about figures like Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose, women who broadcast propaganda to demoralize troops in both European and Pacific fronts. But this was far more advanced. The voices were male, neutral, and often sounded like ordinary American broadcasters. They didn't insult the soldiers, they sympathized with them, and that made them dangerous. Among the units stationed near the Rhine, rumors began spreading faster than any official correction could keep up with. Did you hear about the collapse in the north? They say command is pulling out. They said it on the radio. It must be true. The German intelligence teams behind these broadcasts weren't just spreading fear. They were studying its behavior. Every intercepted letter, every captured prisoner gave them data. They learned which stories spread fastest, which lies found roots in tired minds. The war had become psychological science.
In one observation bunker outside Cologne, American communications specialist Raymond Cole worked night shifts monitoring enemy frequencies. At first, he ignored the broadcasts, laughing at their attempts to mimic American humor. But over time, something began to shift. One evening, the voice on the enemy frequency predicted a specific Allied setback, a supply convoy delayed due to mechanical failure. The next day, that exact report came through official channels. It was coincidence, but to Cole, it didn't feel like one. He started listening more, not out of curiosity, but anxiety. The voice seemed to know things it shouldn't. It spoke about American divisions by name, about shortages, about soldiers waiting for letters that never came. The line between fact and fiction began to blur inside his mind. Cole wasn't alone. Across forward positions, soldiers found themselves drawn to the broadcasts. The comfort of hearing familiar voices from home, even if the news was grim, it felt closer to truth than silence. But the cost was invisible. Trust began to erode. Some officers ordered all radios confiscated. Others didn't bother. They couldn't fight what soldiers might hear through rumors instead. The damage had already spread, and it was psychological, not logistical. Reports reached Allied command of increased hesitation during missions, of soldiers doubting written orders, fearing they were part of a cover-up. The propaganda's success wasn't measured in captured ground. It was measured in lost certainty. For the Germans, this operation wasn't just an experiment. It was desperation turned into precision. Their armies were collapsing, but their propaganda was still advancing. They had learned one terrifying truth, that in modern warfare,
The mind could be made to surrender before the body ever did. As Allied analysts worked to decode the broadcasts, they discovered how deeply engineered they were. Authentic American recordings had been spliced into enemy segments. Real songs, real voices, even genuine news snippets taken from intercepted Allied transmissions. Each broadcast was scripted like theater, blending fact and fiction so perfectly that even seasoned officers found themselves double-checking official communiques afterward. And yet, despite the confusion, cracks began to appear on the German side. Intelligence intercepts revealed that some of their own broadcasters questioned the mission's purpose. They knew they weren't turning the tide, they were only delaying the inevitable. But the operation still served its purpose. It planted doubt. It made soldiers wonder what was real, what was false, and whether the line between the two even existed anymore. Raymond Cole's section was one of those directly affected. His fellow operators noticed his silence growing, his once steady hand on the radio trembling slightly when static broke into that familiar voice. The war had moved from guns to ghosts, invisible voices that lived inside men's thoughts. By late February, American intelligence finally identified the full structure of the enemy's propaganda operations, what they called black radio. It was a masterpiece of deception, one last attempt to weaken the Allied spirit before Germany's collapse. But what the enemy didn't anticipate was how quickly the Americans would adapt. As the winter dragged into spring, countermeasures began taking shape. The U.S. Psychological Warfare Division started building a new kind of weapon, not one of lies, but of truth. Because if the enemy could fabricate reality, then America would do something harder. They would reclaim it. And as the enemy's false broadcasts reached their peak, a quiet response was already forming behind the front lines. A mission that would turn the entire propaganda war upside down. The next phase had begun, and this time the truth was going on the offensive.
By March 1945, the war was tilting toward its end, but not its peace. The front lines were alive with whispers, not gunfire. Soldiers no longer feared the next shell, they feared the next rumor. American commanders realized that the fight for Europe's liberation now had a hidden front, the battle for belief itself. Inside a modest stone building on the outskirts of Paris, a small group of men and women worked through sleepless nights. This was the Psychological Warfare Division, a branch few soldiers even knew existed. Its members weren't typical warriors. They were journalists, linguists, artists, and psychologists. Their weapons were words, paper, and ideas. At the head of this effort stood Colonel Paul Reynolds, a strategist known for his calm precision. He understood something vital, that truth, when sharpened, could cut deeper than propaganda. His mission was simple but revolutionary: fight the enemy's lies with verified reality. The challenge was immense. German propaganda was faster, more theatrical, and often appeared before real news reached the front. By the time Allied reports corrected the falsehoods, damage was already done. Soldiers believed what they had read or heard first. So Reynolds flipped the strategy. Instead of reacting, his team would act first. They launched what historians later called Operation Clarity. It was built on one principle: authenticity. Every leaflet, every broadcast, every message must be verifiable, provable, undeniable. The plan unfolded like a campaign of truth. Within days, Allied planes began dropping millions of leaflets over the front lines. But unlike the enemy's lies, these papers carried undeniable evidence. They showed real photographs of German cities reduced to rubble from Allied air raids, images already confirmed by neutral observers.
Each leaflet included small print citations of actual German newspapers, proving the authenticity. The effect was immediate.
German soldiers, accustomed to grand illusions of victory, found themselves staring at their own ruined cities printed on crisp white paper. The words beneath read, "This is what your leaders call triumph." Meanwhile, to American troops, new bulletins were distributed across units. Each included a truth check system, a simple code allowing soldiers to verify official reports with their commanding officers. It was a psychological vaccine, inoculating them against the virus of misinformation. Reynolds's team worked relentlessly, analyzing every German broadcast and publication, exposing each manipulation with cold precision. They began publishing counter-reports titled The Truth Frontline, which traveled through supply routes and airdrops faster than any rumor. The Americans had turned information into a weapon of defense and offense. Behind the scenes, the Morale Operations Branch coordinated with Reynolds's division to strike back directly. Their tactic wasn't to invent counter-lies. It was to weaponize truth itself. They released leaflets quoting German generals' own words, letters, captured documents, and orders revealing collapsing morale inside the Reich. They included genuine casualty reports, verified production failures, and authentic letters from German prisoners describing humane treatment in Allied camps. Each detail was deliberate, each statistic documented. The results astonished even the skeptics. In some regions, surrender rates among German troops rose by nearly 30% within weeks of the Truth Campaign. The contrast between their leaders' words and the undeniable facts became unbearable. Truth, it turned out, had a weight of its own. But Reynolds knew this war wasn't just about defeating enemy morale. It was about reclaiming the trust of his own men. He personally oversaw the distribution of small field journals, brief bulletins designed to remind American soldiers that they weren't fighting in the dark. Each issue opened with a quote from Roosevelt or Eisenhower, followed by verifiable updates from multiple fronts. No exaggeration, no sensationalism, just fact. It was a quiet revolution in warfare communication, one that built strength through honesty. Still, the fight was far from over. Enemy radio continued to pulse through the night, spewing half-truths mixed with American swing music. The temptation to listen was strong. But now, the soldiers were prepared. The truth checks gave them certainty. They learned to question sources, to verify, to resist. And now something remarkable began to happen. German propaganda units, monitoring Allied morale, reported a sudden change. Their usual methods were losing power. Soldiers no longer reacted with fear or confusion. They laughed. They recognized the tricks. The lies had lost their grip. For the first time in the war, German intelligence began censoring their own broadcasts, unsure of what information the Americans had already exposed. The truth had begun to turn back the tide. But Reynolds wasn't satisfied. He wanted to take the fight directly into enemy territory, to make the German soldier question his own commanders the way Americans had once doubted theirs. His next plan was bold, a direct psychological offensive into Germany's heart. New leaflets appeared over German trenches showing destroyed factories in Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin. The text underneath read, "Your leader said your city stands strong. Look again." Others featured photographs of captured Wehrmacht officers describing their treatment in Allied custody. Alive, fed, unhurt. The message was subtle, but devastating. Surrender was safer than loyalty to a collapsing regime. It worked. In sectors near the Ruhr and Saar, entire groups of soldiers began walking toward Allied lines, carrying these leaflets as proof they had chosen to surrender. Some even tucked them into their pockets as protective charms, believing the truth printed on them would keep them alive. Reynolds' truth warriors had achieved what bombs could not: a moral collapse inside the enemy ranks.
Captured German reports confirmed it. Commanders begged their superiors to ban Allied leaflets entirely. Some units were ordered to shoot anyone caught reading them. That order alone proved how afraid the Reich could become, not of Allied firepower, but of Allied facts. Every night, the printing presses at the Psychological Warfare Division roared with life. Machines produced millions of sheets that fluttered into the German sky, each carrying the one thing the enemy could no longer produce: reality. The battlefield had transformed. No longer just trenches and artillery, but paper and truth. No longer noise and chaos, but clarity and conviction. By the end of March, Reynolds' operations had spread across 28 languages, reaching millions. The effect was measurable, undeniable, and deeply human. Soldiers on both sides began seeing the war for what it was: not the glorious campaign promised by propaganda, but the human tragedy it had become. The Americans had done the impossible. They had turned truth into a weapon stronger than deception. But the enemy wasn't done yet. Deep inside collapsing Germany, propaganda chiefs were preparing one last desperate move: an operation designed to destroy the Allied psychological front entirely. Reynolds didn't know when it would strike, but he could sense it coming. The quiet before the storm had returned, and this time the paper war would decide how history remembered the end of the greatest conflict the world had ever known.
By April 1945, Germany was collapsing. Allied armies pressed from every direction. Cities lay in ruins. And yet, somewhere deep inside the Reich, a final plan was being drafted. Not with tanks, but with typewriters. Not with explosives, but with words. Its code name was Operation Paper Fortress. It was to be Germany's last psychological strike, a desperate attempt to fracture Allied unity and create chaos within their advancing ranks. The plan was astonishing in scale. German intelligence intended to flood the entire Western Front with counterfeit American orders, fake newspapers, and forged presidential directives. The goal was simple but catastrophic: make the Allies believe that their leadership had collapsed, that Eisenhower had been removed, and that the war was no longer theirs to win. The plan would be executed in a single night. Thousands of planes were to release to propaganda over Allied positions from Belgium to the Rhine. Each leaflet was crafted with surgical precision. Official seals were replicated, signatures forged, even the texture of command paper copied down to the fibers. It was, in every sense, the final weapon of a dying regime, a fortress built on lies. But days before the operation could launch, Colonel Paul Reynolds and his Psychological Warfare Division intercepted fragments of intercepted German messages. Short, coded transmissions spoke of a mass dissemination across the Western Front. It was vague, but the tone was urgent. Reynolds immediately convened his core team. Analysts spread maps across tables, marking suspected drop zones. The conclusion was chilling. If this operation succeeded, the confusion could cripple entire divisions at the edge of victory. They had 72 hours to stop it. What followed became one of the least known but most decisive intelligence races of the war.
Reynolds ordered round-the-clock operations. Printers thundered through the night. Communications officers dispatched emergency cables to every corps headquarters, warning of the impending deception. But he knew mere warnings weren't enough. If the Germans were about to weaponize false information, the Americans needed to inoculate the truth before the lie arrived. And so, Reynolds designed a counteroffensive unlike anything attempted before. Within 24 hours, Allied aircraft were loaded with millions of preemptive leaflets. Not propaganda, but warnings. Each carried the same message. Enemy planes may soon drop forged Allied documents. Verify every order. Trust only official sources. The truth is your weapon. The simplicity was genius.
It placed the burden of awareness directly into every soldier's hands. Meanwhile, Reynolds' team created authentication codes, short, easy-to-check marks embedded in legitimate Allied papers and broadcasts. Any document lacking that code was to be treated as false. They didn't stop there. To confuse German intelligence, the Americans planted their own leaked documents into channels they knew the enemy monitored. These false leaks suggested that Allied command already knew the details of the German plan and was preparing a massive counteraction. It was deception within truth, a psychological feint. For 72 hours, the race against time played out like a thriller behind the front lines. While bombers roared overhead, printing presses echoed in the basements of Paris and London. Each hour counted. And then, on the night of April 10th, German planes took to the sky. The operation had begun. Across the Western Front, the air shimmered with falling paper. Leaflets rained down by the millions, announcements of Eisenhower's dismissal, orders for strategic withdrawal, forged presidential letters demanding immediate cessation of hostilities. For a few tense hours, confusion rippled across Allied positions. Soldiers stared at what appeared to be real documents bearing official stamps, familiar names. For a moment, the air felt heavy with doubt. But then something extraordinary happened.
Instead of panic, soldiers began comparing the leaflets to their official codes. They spotted the missing authentication marks. They recognized the warnings they'd received earlier. The deception fell apart before it could take hold. The Germans had miscalculated. This time, the Allies were ready. Moments later, American loudspeakers along the front lines came alive, broadcasting clear, verified messages from authentic commanders. Each communication confirmed the truth and debunked the forgeries in real time. The psychological trap had been defused. But Reynolds had one more surprise waiting. As German aircraft completed their mission, they unknowingly flew through Allied air corridors already filled with counter-propaganda leaflets. Millions of American papers raining over German positions. These leaflets carried a different kind of message, undeniable proof of Germany's collapse. They included real photographs of Berlin burning, copies of Hitler's own speeches contradicting each other, and captured letters from German officers admitting the war was lost. When those leaflets fell over German troops, disbelief turned into despair. Soldiers read them in silence, realizing that even their last great propaganda offensive had been anticipated and neutralized. Operation Paper Fortress had failed, not because of firepower, but because of foresight. In the aftermath, Allied intelligence confirmed that entire German units surrendered within days. Many of their soldiers carried the Allied truth leaflets folded inside their uniforms, believing them more than their own leaders.
Captured documents later revealed that the German propaganda ministry had poured more resources into that single operation than into supplying some frontline divisions. It was a final act of illusion from a regime collapsing under the weight of its own lies. When the Allies reached the propaganda headquarters in Western Germany, they found the evidence of the failure. Entire warehouses stacked to the ceiling with unused, forged newspapers, counterfeit documents, and undelivered false orders. An empire of deception that had fallen before it could launch its final strike. Reynolds' team called it the victory of verification. For the soldiers who had endured months of confusion and psychological manipulation, this triumph meant more than the defeat of an enemy tactic. It was the restoration of trust. Trust in command, in communication, and in one another. But victory carried a quiet cost. Many of the intelligence officers involved in the operation would later write of the invisible strain, the realization that even truth in war had to be manufactured, measured, and deployed like ammunition. As April gave way to May, and the guns across Europe finally began to fall silent, the world came to understand a profound truth, that the final battle of World War II wasn't fought in the streets of Berlin, but in the minds of men across the front lines. And when the smoke cleared, it wasn't propaganda that held the field. It was trust, fragile,
scarred, but standing.
The war ended not with a final explosion, but with silence. In May 1945, that silence spread across Europe like a second dawn. It rolled through ruined cities, through empty fields, through the fractured hearts of millions. And behind that silence, a truth emerged, one that had survived the most powerful propaganda machine the world had ever seen. As Allied forces swept through the remnants of Germany, they uncovered more than destroyed weapons and abandoned bunkers. They found the ruins of a psychological empire. In underground vaults and sealed warehouses, American investigators discovered mountains of printed material, newspapers, forged military orders, counterfeit magazines, even family letters that had never reached their intended victims. Millions of pages stacked floor to ceiling, every one of them a weapon that never fired. Documents revealed that by the war's end, the Nazi propaganda ministry had been spending more money on printing presses than on ammunition. It was their final delusion, believing that lies could outlast defeat. The numbers were staggering. Over 6 billion leaflets had been dropped across Europe by both sides since 1940. But only one approach, the American one, had proven decisive. Not through deception, but through exposure. Not through illusion, but illumination. Reports captured from German command confirmed it. Their own officers admitted that Allied counterpropaganda had devastated troop morale. One colonel wrote that the Americans made truth more dangerous than bullets. Inside one of those warehouses, investigators found something else. An unfinished German plan. It detailed future post-war propaganda strategies designed to rewrite the story of the Reich after its defeat. Even in collapse, they had intended to fight truth with myth, but the war ended too soon for their illusions to take hold.
For men like Raymond Cole, the radio operator who once doubted his own side's reports, the end of the war brought quiet healing, but not easily. He returned home with a mind still haunted by the voices that had filled the airwaves. For months, he struggled to believe news broadcasts, fearing they might be another layer of manipulation. Only when he visited a hospital in England, meeting soldiers who had survived the same psychological assault, did he begin to understand. They weren't weak for believing. They were human. The invisible war had wounded them just as deeply as the physical one. Over time, Cole began keeping a journal, a simple notebook where he wrote one sentence every morning. Truth must always be checked, not assumed. He would later say that writing those words was his own quiet act of recovery. His story mirrored thousands of others. Across the Allied forces, men who had fought on this invisible battlefield carried unseen scars. Studies conducted after the war documented the psychological toll. Anxiety, distrust, fatigue from constant manipulation. The battle for truth had left its mark on them all. But it had also taught something profound. The Psychological Warfare Division's final report to Washington summarized it in one line. Victory was achieved not by the volume of words, but by their verifiability. That statement would echo through generations of military and media strategy. The American principle of truth-based communication became the foundation for future psychological operations during the Cold War. Where the Germans had relied on deceit, the Americans built their strength on transparency, the idea that truth, openly shown, could stand as its own defense. It changed how wars were fought and how peace was maintained. Yet behind every document, every analysis, there were people who had lived through the confusion. The young soldiers who had picked up enemy leaflets in the snow at Bastogne, the analysts who stayed awake night after night decoding counterfeit reports, the journalists who risked their lives printing verified bulletins for troops at the front. Their war didn't earn medals. Their victories didn't appear on maps. But without them, the Allied army might have fractured from within. Colonel Paul Reynolds would later write in his memoirs, "We discovered that truth is not fragile. It only needs courage to be told before lies can spread." That courage defined the closing months of the war. As Allied forces entered Berlin, Soldiers found propaganda leaflets fluttering among the debris, messages still claiming Germany would rise again, that defeat was an illusion, but no one believed them anymore. The words had lost their power. The air itself seemed tired of lies. In the ruins of the propaganda ministry, investigators discovered a final message scrawled across a wall, written by a defeated German officer. Words failed. For the Americans who walked through those shattered offices, it was a fitting epitaph. The propaganda war had ended exactly as it began, with paper falling from the sky. But this time it wasn't lies drifting through the air. It was Allied leaflets carrying truth, messages urging surrender, survival, and peace. Those leaflets saved lives. Thousands of German soldiers laid down their weapons after reading them. Some clutched them like proof of safety as they approached Allied lines. The same paper that once spread deceit now carried deliverance. That was the real victory, but it came with a quiet price. For every soldier who walked home, there was a lingering question. How many battles had been fought not on the ground, but inside their minds? How many decisions were shaped by the unseen hands of propaganda before they ever pulled a trigger? In that sense, the war never truly ended. It evolved. The lessons of 1945 became the blueprint for a new world, one where the battlefield extended into newspapers, broadcasts, and every form of information that shaped human belief. The truth had won, but it had shown how fragile truth could be. And for those who had witnessed it, victory carried a bittersweet weight. They had survived both the visible war and the invisible one. They had seen how easily facts could be bent and how costly it was to make them straight again. Yet, in the quiet after the storm, there remained one unshakable belief that even when truth is buried beneath deception, it never dies. It only waits to be uncovered. And in that waiting lies the strength of a free people, a nation built not on propaganda, but on the courage to face reality, no matter how painful. The Americans had won, but they knew it was not a victory without loss. It was a victory through truth, hard, earned, and unforgettable.
The war was over, but something far more lasting remained, an awareness that battle no longer required bullets. It only required belief. When the last German surrender was signed in May 1945, the Allies inherited more than victory. They inherited evidence of a war that had been fought in silence, through papers, broadcasts, and whispers. A war not for land, but for the human mind. It would come to be known by historians as the invisible battlefield. In the years that followed, analysts reviewed thousands of captured files, dissecting how the Nazi propaganda system had tried to twist perception itself into a weapon. They found detailed manuals describing how to fabricate hope, engineer despair, and replace truth with repetition. It was an empire of illusion, and its collapse revealed the cost of deceit. The German soldiers who had once believed in false victories described their final days with shock and disbelief. They told interrogators that they had been shown one version of the world until the moment Allied leaflets fell from the sky. Then reality arrived all at once, sudden, overwhelming, undeniable. The same men who once shouted slogans now whispered questions. They hadn't lost their courage, they had lost their certainty. That was the true power of the propaganda war, not its lies, but its ability to make truth seem uncertain. For the Americans, this realization transformed how they saw their own strength. They understood now that democracy's greatest weapon wasn't its army, its economy, or even its technology. It was transparency, the ability to face truth without fear. Colonel Reynolds called it the American advantage. He wrote, "The lie must always hide, but the truth can afford to stand in daylight." The contrast was profound.
Where Germany's propaganda warehouses stood filled with undelivered forgeries, the American printing presses never stopped producing verified news, even in war's darkest hours. The enemy hoarded illusion. America circulated truth. And that difference became symbolic, a reflection of two worlds. In the ashes of Berlin, Allied soldiers walked past mountains of discarded papers, millions of counterfeit orders, falsified magazines, and unfinished propaganda posters. They were relics of a system that tried to shape reality and failed. Meanwhile, in liberated cities, people clutched American leaflets, proof that their surrender, their safety, their hope were based on facts, not fiction. Some German soldiers even folded those leaflets into their pockets before surrendering, carrying them like small passports to a new beginning. One American historian later described it perfectly. The Germans dropped lies by the millions. The Americans answered with one weapon they could not counterfeit: reality.
When the Cold War began, psychological warfare didn't disappear, it evolved. But now, it carried the lessons learned from Bastogne, Paris, and the Rhine, that the surest defense against manipulation was openness, and the surest weapon was truth. And yet, the story of that invisible war remained largely forgotten. Most veterans who fought it never saw their names in the history books. There were no parades for leaflet writers or code analysts, no medals for those who fought misinformation instead of bullets. But they were the ones who protected the foundation of everything the Allies stood for: belief grounded in fact. The legacy they left behind was more than military strategy. It was a moral compass. Because, when the last bomb had fallen and the last broadcast had faded, the war's final victory didn't belong to the loudest voice. It belonged to the truest one. The world had learned something profound: that the strength of a democracy lies not in its ability to silence lies, but in its confidence to confront them. And so, when historians look back at that final year of World War II, they see not just a war of armies and nations, but a war of perception, one fought in the minds of millions, invisible, yet decisive. That was the true battlefield. And in that battle, the Americans discovered the most powerful weapon ever forged, not built of steel or fire, but of honesty and conviction. In the end, the greatest bombs never exploded. The most decisive bullets were never fired. Victory came on paper wings, fragile, silent, yet heavier than iron. The enemy dropped lies by the millions. America answered with something far stronger. And when the last leaflet settled on the soil of a broken continent, it carried not deception's weight, but the unbearable lightness of what was real. The propaganda war had ended, and truth had won.